My parents treated my brothers like royalty and acted like I didn't exist. So I cut them off and they went crazy, and then the rain came down in relentless sheets, soaking through my thin school uniform as I sat on the cold concrete steps of Magnolia Elementary. The parking lot was empty now, except for a few abandoned cars glistening under the streetlights that had flickered on prematurely. The teachers had all gone home, trusting that every child had been picked up. Every child except me. I clutched my backpack tightly, pressing it against my chest in a vain attempt to stay warm. My socks squished inside my shoes, the cold creeping up my legs like an unwelcome guest. I wasn't sure how long I had been sitting there. Time seemed to stretch in moments like these, making it feel like hours. The storm had started with a drizzle during lunch, but by dismissal, it was a full-blown downpour. I kept hoping to see the headlights of my parents' car, but as usual, hope was just a cruel trick. The janitor finally noticed me. Mr. Henderson was his name, a kind older man with graying hair and a warm smile. He walked over, concern written across his face. "Sarah, what are you still doing here? Didn't anyone come for you?" I shrugged, swallowing the lump in my throat. "They're probably running late," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. Mr. Henderson frowned, clearly not convinced, but he didn't push me further. "Do you have a phone to call them?" I shook my head. "I don't think anyone's home." He hesitated for a moment, then gave me his umbrella and told me to stay safe. I thanked him and started the long walk home. It was dark now, and the streets were empty except for the occasional car splashing through the flooded roads. By the time I reached the front door, I was drenched and shivering. My fingers struggled to turn the key in the lock. When I stepped inside, I was met with warmth, but not the kind that felt inviting. My mom, Rebecca, sat on the couch flipping through one of her magazines. She glanced up briefly, then back down again. "Oh, you're back. Dinner's in the fridge," she said, her tone devoid of any concern or curiosity. That was it. No questions about why I was late. No apology for forgetting me. No acknowledgement that I had been stranded for hours in a storm. I stood there for a moment, water pooling at my feet, before trudging into the kitchen to find the leftovers she had mentioned. My brothers, Ethan and Ryan, were in the living room playing video games. The sound of their laughter and rapid button mashing filled the house. I peeked in, hoping for some sort of greeting or even a glance, but they didn't look up. I was invisible again. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the rain hammering against the window, I thought about how normal this had become. I had been left at school so many times that even my teachers noticed. Miss Blake, my favorite teacher, had started offering to drive me home whenever my parents forgot. Once, during a parent-teacher conference, she gently suggested to my mom that it might be a good idea to set up a carpool system. My mom had laughed it off, saying, "Sarah's independent. She manages just fine." But I wasn't fine. My family wasn't like other families. Ethan, the eldest, was the golden boy. At 17, he was everything parents dreamed of: smart, charming, and ambitious. He had a shelf full of academic awards and was already being courted by prestigious universities. My parents beamed with pride whenever they talked about him, their voices dripping with admiration. Ryan, at 15, was the fun one. He was athletic, popular, and the life of every party. His soccer trophies lined the walls of the living room, and our parents never missed a game. He had an endless stream of friends who came over after school, filling the house with energy and laughter. And then there was me, just Sarah, 11 years old, quiet, and easy to overlook. One of my earliest memories of feeling invisible was my 9th birthday. My mom had thrown a party, but it wasn't for me. She invited her friends and their kids, none of whom I knew very well. I had asked if I could invite my classmates, but she waved me off, saying, "It's easier this way, sweetheart. You don't really have that many friends, do you?" Her words stung, but I didn't argue. At the party, I sat in a corner watching everyone else have fun. The cake was beautiful, but it had my mom's name written all over it, not literally, but in the way it was decorated to impress her friends rather than celebrate me. I blew out the candles while they clapped half-heartedly, and I remember wishing I could disappear entirely. That feeling of being a background character in my own life never really went away. It followed me to school, where I excelled academically but never felt celebrated. It was present at home, where every achievement of mine was overshadowed by my brother's. Once, when I proudly announced I had won a writing contest, Ethan laughed and said, "Wow, a writing contest. That's something." Ryan chimed in, "Stop trying so hard to get noticed, Sarah. It's embarrassing." After that, I stopped sharing. Even the extended family seemed complicit in my invisibility. My aunts and uncles would smile politely when I spoke, then quickly turn the conversation back to Ethan or Ryan. My Aunt Caroline once pulled me aside at a family reunion and said, "You just need to try harder, sweetie. Make your parents proud and they'll come around." I had tried. For years, I had tried. But no matter what I did, it was never enough. That night, lying in the dark, I made a promise to myself. One day, I would leave this place. I would build a life where I wasn't invisible. A life where I wasn't just Sarah, the forgotten child. I didn't know how or when, but I knew I had to try. If my family couldn't see me, then I would find people who could. By the time I started high school, I had learned to keep my head down and blend into the background. It was easier that way, safer, even. Magnolia High wasn't a place where you stood out unless you wanted to get knocked down, and I already had enough experience with that at home. I wasn't popular like Ryan or naturally brilliant like Ethan, but I had my own kind of focus. I poured myself into my studies, staying late at the library to finish assignments or working on extra credit projects. If I couldn't make my family notice me, I could at least make a name for myself in the classroom. I wasn't just good at school, I was exceptional. By the time I was 16, I had a near-perfect GPA, joined the debate team, and even started a small tutoring program for younger students struggling with math. My teachers noticed, and for the first time, I felt seen. Ms. Blake, my English teacher, was especially supportive. "Sarah, you're a natural writer," she said one afternoon after class. "You have a way of capturing emotions that's beyond your years. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I clung to her words like a lifeline. It was the kind of encouragement I had never heard at home. At home, the routine hadn't changed much. Ethan was still the golden child, now attending a prestigious university in another state, and Ryan was the local hero, dominating the soccer field and charming everyone in his orbit. My parents, Rebecca and Greg, lavished attention on them like it was their full-time job. Once, when I came home with a certificate for winning a regional essay competition, my mom barely glanced at it. "That's nice, Sarah," she said before turning back to the dinner she was preparing. "Did you know Ryan's team is one game away from making the state finals?" I nodded, my chest tight with disappointment. "Yeah, he mentioned it." "Oh, you should come to the game on Saturday," she added, as though it was an afterthought. Saturday came and went, and I spent it at home, writing another essay. No one noticed I wasn't there. It wasn't just the lack of attention. It was the dismissiveness that hurt the most. Ethan visited home for Thanksgiving during my junior year, and the dinner conversation turned to college plans. I mentioned that I was considering applying to universities on the East Coast. "Why would you go so far away?" Ethan asked, his tone dripping with skepticism. Before I could answer, Ryan chimed in, "Probably wants to reinvent herself. That's what people do when they've got nothing going for them." My dad laughed at Ryan's comment like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. I felt my cheeks burn, but I kept my mouth shut. Defending myself would only make things worse. Instead, I doubled down on my schoolwork. My grades were impeccable, and by my senior year, I had climbed to the top of my class. When I found out I was going to be valedictorian, I was thrilled, but also terrified. Would my family even care? I tried to give them a chance. I sent out formal invitations to the graduation ceremony, slipping them into the pile of mail on the kitchen counter. Days turned into weeks, and I heard nothing. The night before graduation, I worked up the courage to ask my mom directly, "Did you see the invitation I left for you?" She looked up from her crossword puzzle, her brow furrowed. "Invitation for what?" "For my graduation tomorrow," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "Oh, that," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "We'll see if we can make it. Ryan has a soccer game in the afternoon, though, so it might be tight." Tight. That was her word for it. The next day, I stood at the podium, delivering a speech I had worked on for weeks. I scanned the crowd of proud parents and excited families, searching for familiar faces. Their seats were empty. After the ceremony, Ms. Blake found me in the hallway, tears welling in her eyes. "You did beautifully, Sarah," she said, pulling me into a hug. "You should be so proud of yourself." I smiled weakly, grateful for her support, but it didn't fill the hollow ache in my chest. Later that evening, I overheard my dad talking on the phone. "Ryan scored 2 goals today," he said proudly. "Oh, Sarah?" She had some school thing. Nothing big. That was it. That was all I was to them. A school thing. The summer before college was a blur of preparation and anxiety. I knew that if I wanted to succeed, I'd have to do it on my own. My parents' wealth could have covered my tuition, but they didn't offer a dime. Ethan got a brand new car when he graduated. Ryan's dorm fees and expenses were covered without a second thought. For me, there was nothing. I applied for scholarships and took out loans, spending every spare moment working part-time at a diner to save up for textbooks and supplies. My boss, a no-nonsense woman named Diane, took a liking to me and started giving me extra shifts. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Sarah," she said one evening as we closed up. "Don't let anyone hold you back." Her words meant more to me than she probably realized. When the day finally came to leave for college, I packed up my belongings into a single suitcase. No one came to see me off. As I sat on the bus, watching the familiar streets of my hometown fade into the distance, I felt a mix of fear and relief. For the first time, I was free. Free to build a life where I wasn't just Sarah, the overlooked little sister or the forgotten daughter. As the bus rumbled on, I made a silent promise to myself. I would prove to the world and to myself that I was worth noticing. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to navigate. And for the first time in my life, that was enough. College was supposed to be my fresh start, and in many ways it was. The campus, with its sprawling lawns and towering brick buildings, felt like another world. I shared a tiny dorm room with a girl named Amanda, who was kind but loud, always playing music or chatting on the phone. It was a little chaotic, but it was also mine. For the first time, I wasn't surrounded by people who ignored me or treated me like an afterthought. That first semester was tough. My classes were challenging, and balancing part-time work at a campus cafe with my studies wasn't easy. But I thrived on the independence. Every essay I submitted and every shift I completed was a small victory, a reminder that I could survive on my own. I started working weekends at a small bookstore downtown, owned by an older woman named Mrs. Kensington. She was in her 60s, with silver hair always tied up in a neat bun and a habit of humming while she worked. From the first day, she treated me with a warmth I wasn't used to. "You have an eye for detail," she said one afternoon after I reorganized the poetry section without being asked. "You're going to go far, Sarah. I can tell." Her kindness was unexpected and overwhelming. It wasn't the grand gestures I'd always craved from my family, but the simple acknowledgement that I existed and mattered was enough to bring tears to my eyes. While I was finding my footing in college, my family barely seemed to notice I was gone. There were no calls, no texts, no care packages. Nothing. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need them anymore. But then Thanksgiving came around. My roommate left to spend the holiday with her family, leaving the dorm eerily quiet. I tried to keep busy, working extra shifts at the bookstore and catching up on homework, but the loneliness crept in. Against my better judgment, I called home. My mom answered after a few rings. "Oh, Sarah," she said, her tone flat. "How's school?" "It's good," I replied, trying to sound upbeat. I wanted to say Happy Thanksgiving. There was a pause. I could hear voices and laughter in the background. "Thanks, sweetie," she said quickly. "We're just sitting down for dinner. Ryan's got his girlfriend over, and Ethan flew in for the weekend. You should have told us you were calling. We could have planned something." My stomach twisted. "That's okay. I just wanted to say hi." "All right, well, take care," she said before hanging up. That was it. No invitation to come home, no interest in how I was really doing. I stared at the phone for a long time after the call ended, the silence in the dorm pressing down on me. It was then that I started to realize how little I truly meant to them. A month later, during winter break, I made the mistake of visiting home. The moment I walked through the door, I overheard my dad talking to a neighbor. Only 2 kids, huh? You're lucky. 3's a handful. My dad laughed. Nah, it's just the boys now. Sarah's off doing her own thing. Keeps us plenty busy. My heart sank. It wasn't a slip of the tongue or a misunderstanding. They genuinely didn't acknowledge me as part of the family anymore. That night, I packed my things and left without saying goodbye. I couldn't stay in a house where I was nothing more than a ghost. When I returned to campus, I made a decision. If they could pretend I didn't exist, then I could do the same. The first step was blocking their numbers. It felt dramatic at first, but every time I saw their names on my phone, a wave of anxiety crashed over me. Once they were blocked, I felt a strange sense of relief. Next, I unfriended them on social media. It was oddly satisfying to remove their comments and tags from my photos, erasing the digital evidence of our connection. I even went as far as deleting some family photos from my profile. It felt like shedding old skin, painful but necessary. Over time, I realized I needed to cut ties with more than just my immediate family. Some of my extended relatives, like my Aunt Caroline, had always dismissed my feelings. She used to say things like, "Your parents mean well," or "You're just being sensitive." I stopped replying to her texts and calls, and eventually, they stopped coming. My therapist, Dr. Morales, was instrumental during this time. I started seeing her after winter break, and she helped me unpack years of neglect and emotional damage. "It's not about punishing them," she said during one session. "It's about protecting yourself. Setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's necessary." Her words stayed with me. I took things further, ensuring my parents couldn't interfere in my life even in emergencies. I updated my emergency contacts at work and at the doctor's office, listing my best friend Julia instead. She was one of the few people who had always been there for me. "You're my rock," I told her one night after class. "And you're mine," she replied without hesitation. Julia became my chosen family, the sister I never had. We spent holidays together, cooking cheap meals in her tiny apartment and laughing over silly movies. It wasn't traditional, but it was warm and real. As I built this new life, I started to feel a sense of freedom I had never known. Living without the weight of my family's indifference was liberating. But of course, it wasn't that simple. My parents started sending passive-aggressive messages through mutual acquaintances, accusing me of being distant and ungrateful. "I'm too busy for drama," I told Julia one day, showing her a text from my Aunt Caroline about how my parents were heartbroken. "You don't owe them anything," Julia reminded me. She was right. For the first time, I was choosing myself. That spring, I celebrated a major milestone. I got my first promotion at the bookstore. Mrs. Kensington even threw me a little party, complete with cake and balloons. "You're going to do great things, Sarah," she said, handing me a small gift, a beautiful leather-bound journal. That night, as I wrote my thoughts in the journal for the first time, I realized I was finally starting to heal. The road wasn't easy, and there were moments when the guilt crept back in, but I kept moving forward. For the first time, I felt like I was in control of my own life, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. By the time I entered my final year of college, my life looked nothing like it had back in high school. I had carved out a space for myself, a small but meaningful world where I was seen, valued, and loved. The weight of my family's neglect was something I was finally learning to let go of, though it still lingered in the quiet moments when I least expected it. I hadn't spoken to my parents or my brothers, Ethan and Ryan, in over a year. The silence wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, and for the most part, it felt like a relief. But when I logged into social media one rainy afternoon, I found that they hadn't let go as easily as I had. There it was, staring back at me, a long, dramatic post from my mom. It began with a photo of the 3 of them smiling at some family gathering, and the caption was laced with emotional manipulation. "Our hearts are heavy as we try to understand why our youngest daughter has chosen to cut us out of her life. We've always tried our best to be loving and supportive, but sometimes children make decisions that break your heart. We only hope she knows how much we miss her." It was like a punch to the gut. The comments were a mix of blind sympathy and skepticism. Some of her friends wrote things like, "You're such wonderful parents. She'll come around." Others asked pointed questions. "Didn't she graduate as valedictorian?" Why didn't you mention that? I closed the app, my hands shaking. How could they twist the narrative so blatantly? After everything they'd done, or hadn't done, they were now trying to paint themselves as the victims. When I told Julia about the post, she rolled her eyes. Classic manipulation, she said. They're trying to control the narrative because they know they've lost control of you. She was right, of course, but that didn't make it easier to stomach. A week later, I got a text from an unknown number. It was Ethan. Hey, Sarah. I saw Mom's post. Can we talk? I think this has gone too far. Gone too far. As if my choice to prioritize my own mental health was some sort of rebellion. I didn't respond. The messages kept coming, though, from Ethan, from Ryan, even from some of my extended family. My Aunt Caroline left me a voicemail dripping with condescension. Sarah, you need to stop this nonsense and reach out to your parents. Family is everything, and you'll regret this one day. Trust me. It took everything in me not to call her back and list every single thing my family had done, or failed to do, that led me to this point. Instead, I deleted the voicemail and blocked her number. When the messages didn't work, my parents escalated their tactics. A mutual acquaintance, one of their neighbors, reached out to me with a carefully worded email. Your parents are really struggling, Sarah. Your mom mentioned she hasn't heard from you in so long. She's worried sick. Don't you think it's time to mend fences? I stared at the email for a long time before deleting it. Worried sick? The same woman who forgot to pick me up from school countless times? The same woman who dismissed my achievements and openly admitted to others that she only had 2 kids? Their guilt trips weren't working, and I wasn't about to let them worm their way back into my life. Around this time, something unexpected happened. My story, the years of neglect, the loneliness, and my eventual decision to cut ties, started to reach a larger audience. It began with a post I made on Reddit. It wasn't planned. I had been scrolling through a family estrangement forum and decided to share my experience. I wrote about the times I was left behind, the missed graduations, the constant feeling of being invisible in my own home. I didn't name names or include specific details, but the post resonated with people. Within hours, it blew up. Thousands of people commented, sharing their own stories of neglect and estrangement. This is exactly what I went through. One person wrote, "Thank you for putting it into words." Others offered words of support and validation, things I hadn't realized I needed until I read them. You're so brave for walking away. Family is supposed to love and support you, not make you feel worthless. For the first time, I felt like my pain had a purpose. It wasn't just mine to carry anymore. It was part of a larger conversation about breaking cycles of emotional neglect. But the attention didn't go unnoticed. 2 days after my post went viral, I got an email from Ryan. It was short and cold. Take that post down. You're embarrassing the family. If you don't, consider yourself dead to us. I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. I had been dead to them for years. A week later, a letter arrived in the mail. It was a cease and desist notice from my parents' lawyer, accusing me of defamation. I brought it to my own lawyer, a calm, no-nonsense woman named Lisa. She skimmed the letter and shook her head. "This is all bark and no bite," she said. "They don't have a leg to stand on. You're sharing your personal experiences, which is well within your rights." Her reassurance gave me the courage to stand my ground. Instead of backing down, I doubled down. I wrote a follow-up post on Reddit, sharing more details and even some receipts, old emails and texts that showed their indifference and manipulation. The response was overwhelming. People rallied behind me, calling my family out for their behavior. A few even messaged me privately, sharing resources for therapy and legal advice. It was around this time that my career took an unexpected turn. I was offered a promotion at the bookstore, taking on a managerial role. Mrs. Kensington celebrated by throwing me another party, this time inviting a few of my closest friends. As we sat around eating cake and laughing, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. These people weren't my family by blood, but they had become my family in every way that mattered. For the first time, I felt like I was truly building a life for myself. A life where I wasn't defined by my past or tethered to the people who had failed me. But the final straw came a few months later when my parents sent another message through a mutual acquaintance. This time, It was a supposed health scare. My mom claiming she had been hospitalized and needed to see me. I didn't buy it for a second. They had pulled similar stunts in the past, hoping to guilt me into coming back. I told Julia about it, and she nodded knowingly. "They're trying to reel you back in," she said. "Don't let them." And I didn't. Instead, I focused on the life I was building. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments when the weight of it all threatened to pull me down, but I was finally free. Free to write my own story. Free to live without their shadows looming over me. Free to be myself. Months turned into years, and with every passing day, the grip my family once had on me loosened until it was completely gone. The life I had built without them wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. I was no longer weighed down by their absence or the memories of their neglect. Instead, I was focused on the people who truly mattered to me, the ones who had chosen to stay by my side. My Reddit post continued to circulate, sparking conversations about family estrangement and emotional neglect. I received countless messages from people who shared similar stories or thanked me for giving them the courage to set their own boundaries. It was humbling to know my experiences could help others, and it gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't realized I was searching for. One day, I received an unexpected email from a literary agent. They had seen my post and thought my story had the potential to become a book. At first, I hesitated. Reliving those memories in such detail felt daunting, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to put everything out there for the world to see. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like the right thing to do. If my story could help even one person feel less alone, then it was worth it. The process of writing the book was cathartic. I spent months sifting through old memories, writing late into the night, and working with my therapist, Dr. Morales, to process the emotions that came with revisiting the past. The book wasn't just about my family. It was about breaking free from their shadow, finding my voice, and building a life that felt truly mine. When the book was finally published, the response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from readers who saw themselves in my story, thanking me for sharing it. Some asked for advice on how to cut ties with toxic family members, while others simply wanted to let me know they felt seen for the first time. It was strange to think that the pain I had carried for so long was now something that could inspire others. Meanwhile, my personal life continued to flourish. I moved into a small but cozy house with a backyard big enough for my rescue dog, Max, to run around. Not long after, I adopted a second dog, a golden retriever mix named Daisy. The two of them brought a joy to my life that I hadn't known was possible. My chosen family grew as well. Julia, my best friend, remained a constant presence, and our tradition of Sunday dinners became something I looked forward to every week. We rotated between our homes, cooking simple meals and sharing stories about our lives. It was nothing extravagant, but it was meaningful in a way I had never experienced growing up. During one of those dinners, Julia surprised me with a cake. To freedom, it said in bright blue icing. I laughed as tears filled my eyes. "You always know how to make a moment special," I said, pulling her into a hug. "This is just the beginning for you," she said. "You're building something amazing." She was right. Professionally, things were better than ever. After graduating, I landed a job with a nonprofit organization that supported children in foster care and those escaping abusive homes. The work was challenging but deeply rewarding. Every campaign we launched, every fundraiser we organized, felt like a step toward making a difference in the lives of kids who had been through experiences similar to mine. But despite all the progress I had made, there was one final step I needed to take. In a quiet moment one evening, I went through an old box of belongings I had tucked away in the back of my closet. Inside were faded family photos and letters I had kept out of a sense of obligation. One by one, I went through them, deciding what to keep and what to let go. There was a photo of me as a child, sitting on the couch while Ethan and Ryan opened gifts on Christmas morning. I remembered feeling invisible even then, watching as the adults fawned over my brothers while barely acknowledging me. I placed the photo in the pile to be discarded. By the time I was finished, the box was nearly empty. It felt symbolic, like I was finally releasing the weight of the past. That same week, I learned through a mutual acquaintance that my parents had moved away. Their once busy social lives had dwindled, and their reputation in our hometown had taken a hit after my story went public. It was strange to think of them as distant figures, fading into obscurity, but I felt no urge to investigate further. One last attempt came in the form of a handwritten letter from my mother. It was forwarded to me through an old address and arrived on a rainy afternoon. The letter was filled with vague regrets, empty phrases about misunderstandings, and a plea for reconciliation. "We miss you, Sarah," she wrote. "Please come home." It wasn't an apology. It was a plea for me to fit back into their version of reality, where they had done nothing wrong. I didn't respond. Instead, I took the letter to my backyard fire pit, lit a match, and watched it burn. The flames consumed the paper, and as the ashes drifted into the air, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't known I needed. To celebrate how far I'd come, I hosted a dinner at my house, inviting my closest friends. The room was filled with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the warm glow of candlelight. As the evening wound down, I looked around at the people who had become my family. Julia, with her endless kindness and unwavering support. My coworkers, who celebrated every success with genuine pride. Max and Daisy, curled up on the floor, their tails wagging lazily. This was my life now. Not perfect, but mine. In the weeks that followed, I focused on the future. My work at the nonprofit continued to grow, and I even started a small side project, a mentorship program for young adults who were navigating life after estrangement. It was my way of giving back, of turning my pain into something meaningful. When I shared an update on Reddit about how far I'd come, the response was overwhelming. Thousands of people left comments celebrating my progress, sharing their own stories, and offering words of encouragement. "You've come so far, Sarah," one person wrote. "Thank you for showing us that it's possible to break free." As I sat in my living room that evening, watching Max and Daisy play in the yard, I felt a sense of peace I had never known. This was my new chapter. My life, free from the shadows of the past. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was truly living, and I was ready for whatever came next.